The Scriptures speak about the beauty of God, and that all things beautiful find their source and their foundation in the character of God Himself. So that God ultimately is the norm of the good, the norm of the true, and the norm of the beautiful. Today, we're going to look at the subject of drama and the camera. When you think of the arts that are expressed by way of drama, we think back to antiquity, where we realize that drama was an integral part of ancient society. The Greeks, of course, had their great dramatists, and they had their presentations of what was called tragedy and comedy. Some of their plays were basically morality plays that had a point or a moral lesson to them, and that tradition extended throughout Western history. We think of in our own English history of the work of William Shakespeare in England, in which he had produced an astonishing number of plays that are still studied and performed even to this day. And so we have this rich history of drama that continues even in our times in the theater. And we think of the plays that take place in New York City, on Broadway, and so on. But drama, as it existed through most of the history of Western civilization, took a dramatic turn at the beginning of the 20th century with the advent of radio, where drama was now broadcast into thousands and hundreds of thousands of homes over the airways. Now, of course, these dramas that were part of the genre of radio lacked the dimension of the visual, but they concentrated chiefly on adventure stories, mystery stories, entertainment modes, and became the basic launching pad for a kind of drama that's become integrated and basically representative of American entertainment, namely the soap operas. During the day, the soap operas dominated the radio scene, and they were called soap operas because they were these little dramas of conflict that people had, and they were sponsored by soap companies like Oxydol's own Ma Perkins. Some of you remember that. And there was the soap Does, D-U-Z, D-U-Z. Put Does in your washing machine, see your clothes come out so clean. D-U-Z does everything. Or Tide's in, Dirt's out. Or, I mean, we had all these different stories of daily life. They were life situations, sort of the precursors of the television sitcoms, but they weren't all comedies. You had stories like Argyle Sunday and Helen Trent and a host of others that dominated the landscape, particularly in the afternoon. In the evening, radio focused on adventure stories with heroes like Superman, Tennessee Jed, the Lone Ranger, Captain Midnight, and also in the evening, later in the evening, we had the mystery stories that were famous, such as Mr. Keen, Tracer of Lost Persons, Gangbusters, Suspense, and of course my favorite called Inner Sanctum, that opened with the sound of a mausoleum door creaking open, scare the bejabbers out of you. But one of the things that was so interesting about radio in this era of American entertainment history was that you heard the story, but you didn't see it. And so the producers of these programs had to create an atmosphere that provoked the listening audience to use their imagination. And I can remember as a child listening to these programs and visualizing in my own mind what was actually going on, so that I created for myself the images of the personages that were involved in these stories. Then we saw in the middle of the 20th century the advent of television, where everything changed. And television has become such a dominant force in our culture and in our civilization today that there's a sense in which we were caught off guard. No one really could understand or expect and anticipate the revolutionary impact that this medium would have on our culture. And the first change seemed at first to be harmless and innocuous. The change was from allowing us to project our own imaginations. Now the images were produced for us. And now we were able to see the images that communicated the storylines or the drama of television. And this medium became so popular and so deeply rooted in the culture that the average child today, by the time they're 10 years old, will have seen thousands and thousands of more dramas presented than any person, theater lover, in ancient Greece or in Shakespeare's day in England, because this drama is programmed by the hours, ongoing, every single day. And again, in the early days of television, much of television programming followed the scope of radio programming. We had variety shows. We had children's programs like Kukla, Fran and Ollie, Howdy Doody, all kinds of adventure programs, Boston, Blackie, and so on. Sports, news, the Nelson family, and programs of that sort, which were very mild by contemporary standards. In fact, I remember in the early days of television where a controversy emerged when the television industry censors prohibited the mention of the word virgin on broadcast television because the word virgin had sexual connotations and innuendos associated with it. So we might say that things have changed dramatically since that time. We would see news reports about conflicts in the world where movie footage would be relayed back to the studios and then shown at a later date. Compare that with the present experience that we have with television, where television cameras are now posted live in battle scenes and battle arenas where the people of America can watch war happen as it is unfolding right before our eyes. I mean, there's a sense in which television turned a corner with the assassination of John Kennedy. I'll never forget that Sunday afternoon after the assassination when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot to death by Jack Ruby in the police station in Dallas, which was captured on live television. And so there's a sense in which since then our access to real-time and real-life violence and crime has taken over the particular medium. We've seen a revolution of the use of images, where the commentators have talked about our nation becoming a nation that responds not to critical analysis or to intellectual analysis, but we respond to sound bites and video bites where we have images flashed before us that don't give us much time to think about it, and presidential campaigns are run on the ground basis of producing the proper image for a candidate through the use of broadcast television. Just recently I was watching the Fox News Network, and one of their features nightly is the feature called Around the World in 80 Days. No. Around the World in 80 Hours? No. Around the World in 80 Minutes? No. Around the World in 80 Seconds. And so in 1 minute and 20 seconds, you get a capsule summation of everything that's going on in the world up to the minute with these brief, sudden flashing of images that don't give much time for analysis or critical evaluation. But I think we all know the impact of television to some degree on our culture, on the minds of our children, because in a very, very real sense we know that art not only imitates life, but life also imitates art. And the impact of television by creating life situations gives a message to our children as to what is normal, what is basically normative for their experience and their behavior. But this, of course, predated the impact of television with the advent of the film industry. And the film industry is also an industry that involves art, drama, with a camera. And again, the impact of Hollywood on the culture cannot adequately, in my judgment, be measured. But the movie industry, after it went beyond the silent movies and the old Nickelodeons and progressed to talkies and so on, was pretty tame in the early days. The early days, the storylines were quite simple, basic conflict stories, and often the B-westerns, or the so-called odors, were the standard fare, where Hollywood was producing literally hundreds of movies every year. When I was a kid, at our local theater, the local theater showed 6 different movies every week. A double feature on Friday night and Saturday matinee and Saturday night, a different double feature on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, and still a third double feature on Wednesday and Thursday night. So if you were an avid theater goer, as I was, you would see 6 different movies in a single week. I went during my childhood every single Saturday and Sunday, so I saw a minimum of 4 movies a week. Sometimes I would go to the Wednesday or Thursday night showing and have 6 movies in a week, but I saw at least 4 every week for maybe 10 years. So you figure that out. That's like 2,000 movies that I was immersed in as a child. Now again, at the beginning, we would see these serialized westerns with people like Tom Mix, Hopalong Cassidy, and Tim Holt, and Lash LaRue, and people like that. Go to the YMCA, that would be our theater, and they would show one of these segments of the serial each week, and you would wait till the following Saturday to see the next episode. And so you had serialized movies, and then they became full-length movies that were featuring people like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers. And again, like on television, people like Autry and Rogers and the Lone Ranger were idealized heroes who were basically trying to avoid unnecessary violence. The Lone Ranger, for example, was such a good shot that whenever gunplay came into the scene, he would simply shoot the pistol out of the bandit's hand. There was no realistic effort to portray killing or blood and gore and that kind of violence in these movies. Most of the bad guys that Gene Autry and Roy Rogers took care of, they did with their fists, and they wore gloves. It was almost not really bare-knuckled, and nobody ever got a nosebleed from one of their punches. But that was Hollywood. And they had this idealized world that was set before you in these dramas, where there was a clear delineation in the movie between the good guys and the bad guys. You always knew who the good guy was in the cowboy movies because he wore a white hat and usually rode a white horse or a palomino like Trigger. But the bad guys wore the black hats, and they had black shirts, and they wore black horses, and so it was easy to know the players even without a program. But then later on, with the arrival of actors, method actors like Marlon Brando, you saw the intrusion or the invention of the anti-hero. And film became more and more, quote, realistic as it exposed the seamier elements of human existence, and the idealization of the earlier films was set aside. I remember also, even as we saw the issue over the word virgin and censorship with respect to broadcast television, I remember a couple of movies that created a firestorm of controversy when Hollywood produced Duel in the Sun with Gregory Peck, and I believe it was Jennifer Jones, I'm not sure. But there were some scenes in there that faded to black that were suggestive of a sexual encounter, and that was banned in several cities in America. And then later on, the big controversy came with From Here to Eternity with Frank Sinatra and Burt Lancaster and so on. And there was a scene in that where Lancaster is on the beach with his girlfriend, and they're in bathing suits, and they are lying beside each other on the beach. And because they were semi-clad in a prone position on the screen, created an outrage from the American public. Now, I say that because that seems funny today by comparison or by contrast with the standards that are in place for what people see on the screen produced by Hollywood in our day. So there is a new form of realism and a new emphasis on graphics with special effects and the rest. And many Christians have taken the response to film of simply withdrawing completely from it, saying that the film industry today, because it is so enmeshed in gross immorality and offensive language and gratuitous violence with blood and gore, that many in the church have just taken the position that the Christians simply should never go to movies because they're always bad and all of them are bad. On the other hand, the film industry, and apart from these things that are obviously offensive to many, has nevertheless been very important as an artistic medium to communicate important notions and ideas. For example, so much of the history that is learned by people in the United States of earlier eras and epochs is learned not through books, but through the movie. Most of what we have a sense of World War I, unless we were old enough to live through it, comes through film depictions of the situation in World War I, and it's also true for World War II. And there's been very, very important historical war movies produced by Hollywood. A Farewell to Arms, All Quiet on the Western Front, Sergeant York, and many from the World War II theaters as well, and then even recent ones such as Saving Private Ryan and Tora, 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 and so much of what we perceive about what happened on Pearl Harbor comes to us through the graphic images of the recreation of these events in the film industry. Same is true of the Civil War. I mean, despite its popularity for its romance and so on, and the great lines from Rhett Butler and so on, Gone with the Wind gives a classic portrayal of life in the South during the Civil War. And many of us go through life with those images redounding in our thinking about what life was like in the South, particularly during the 19th century. Of course, many of the war movies that were produced during World War II were basically propaganda films to stir up the national pride and patriotism in our conflict against the Germans and against the Japanese in the South Pacific. But they still had value in terms of communicating real life situations around the world. We've also seen Hollywood produce very important films where they put on the screen great classic pieces of literature. Recently, we've seen the third Hollywood production of The Count of Monte Cristo, which I believe is one of the finest novels ever written. Who can forget Gregory Peck's portrayal of Captain Ahab in the film version of Melville's epic Moby Dick? We've seen Jane Eyre, we've seen a host of classical literary pieces brought to life, as it were, on the movie screen. Now, the thing I want to say about the movie industry and also television is that what makes these art forms so powerful, so able to shape nations' behavior and culture and attitudes, is that what happens in the film, particularly, also to a lesser degree in television programming, but particularly in the Hollywood film, what happens is that the producer or the writer, the director, create a world. And one of the basic things that is central to drama is the attempt to create empathy in the viewer, so to draw us to be concerned about the conflict that is unfolding before our eyes. And so this world is created. It's created on celluloid. It is not a real world. It's an imaginary world. We understand that when we see Star Wars or when we see other mythological themes unfolded before us from Tolkien and all the rest, and The Lion King from Disney and the story of Beauty and the Beast. We understand that's mythological. But we think that the rest of these programs are real. And we get so caught up in these films that, take for example Rocky I. I will never forget watching Rocky I when Rocky Balboa, the Italian stallion, is going against Apollo Creed, and Rocky is this down and out punch-drunk fighter from Philadelphia who has two chances to win the heavyweight championship from Apollo Creed. Slim and none, and Slim had left town. And so this Rocky Balboa takes the mother of all beatings at the hands of the reigning champion. But he hangs in there. And there is his girlfriend saying to him, "Win, Rocky, Adrian, win, Rocky, win." And so you get caught up in the drama of the prize fight. And I remember seeing that where we're going into the later rounds and the fight hangs in the balance. The people in the audience are screaming, cheering Rocky on. Win, Rocky, win, Rocky. And we're all caught up in this thing, realizing that we're yelling at a screen up here where there's an image from a projection machine, and there's no Rocky there, there's no Adrian there, there's no Burgess Meredith there. None of these people are there. This is make-believe. And we're so caught up in it that we're cheering the hero. I've seen it also in mystery movies, a suspense movie, when the bad guy's hiding in the door, in the cupboard, and nobody knows it except the audience, and the hero or the heroine doesn't know that there's a killer there. We're screaming, telling her to watch out, as if she could hear it. Now, the reason I mention this is that this tells you how powerful a movie can be to involve us emotionally and psychologically by pulling us into that world. Let me just take a minute to say, when I was a kid and we were first learning about dating and stuff, the thing that they did was they had kissing parties, like during Halloween. Yes, they had kissing parties, where the boys and the girls would come to the parties, they'd have refreshments, and then they'd play post office, you know, and those games like that. Well, whenever we had the opportunity to kiss the different girls, the question that we faced, the moral question, was, is the kiss that we're going to give this young lady a peck on the cheek, or are we going to kiss her, the way we used the language was Hollywood style? The way Alan Ladd would kiss his girlfriend. And it wasn't the way in which they chew each other's mouths up like they do in today's movies, but it was simply a kiss on the lips that was sustained. It was true romance. And that's the way we learned how to respond romantically. Imagine what today's generation is learning about love, about romance, about sex. The thing that's so bad about the sexual activity that you see in the movies and on television is the way in which it is so casually presented. It's not presented as failure or as a conflict or the drama of somebody falling into wickedness, but it's taken for granted that casual sex is part of the American way of life. And again we ask, does life imitate art? Does art imitate life? Both are true. And one of the most powerful shapers of worldview in our culture today is the Hollywood movie. That's why I don't think we can afford to ignore it, but we need to understand it, and we need to communicate to our children about the messages that are being communicated, the worldview that's there, because the worldview that dominates today has been called neo-paganism or neo-barbarianism. And that's what's being presented to our culture, which feeds on gratuitous violence, gratuitous sex, and on meaninglessness.